What if I told you that England once had a king so feared, so grotesquely transformed by his own body, that even his servants believed he carried the mark of the devil himself? This was Henry VIII, a monarch who began life as a radiant golden prince and ended as a bloated tyrant whose corpse burst open on the road to his grave. His story is not just one of power, it is a chilling reminder of how pain, pride, and absolute authority can turn a man into a monster. And if you want to uncover every disturbing secret of this king, hit that subscribe button now, because what comes next is far darker than you imagine. At 18, Henry was the dream of Europe. Tall, athletic, his auburn hair catching the light like molten gold, his smile dazzling foreign courts. He hunted with unmatched vigor, jousted with elegance, and charmed women and men alike with poetry, music, and wit. He was the Renaissance ideal of a prince, the living embodiment of beauty and power. Courtiers whispered that England had never seen a sovereign so radiant, so alive with promise. But fast forward 38 years, and the same man weighed over 400 pounds. His legs festered with ulcers that oozed pus so foul, servants gagged when approaching him. He grew so paranoid that he slept with loaded crossbows by his bed, convinced that everyone around him was plotting betrayal. He executed 2 wives, discarded 2 others, and left his kingdom stained with blood and fear. The Golden Prince had become a walking nightmare. How does such a transformation happen? The answer lies not in superstition, but in a perfect storm of accidents, diseases, and the slow intoxication of unchecked power. Henry's reign began with promise, but fate had already sharpened its blade. In 1536, a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace changed the course of England forever. On that fateful January day, Henry mounted his armored horse, the crowd roaring as lances splintered and banners whipped in the winter air. But in a single disastrous moment, his horse fell, crushing him beneath its weight. Witnesses watched in horror as England's king lay motionless on the ground. For 2 hours, Henry did not wake, and in an age where minutes of unconsciousness meant likely death, courtiers prepared for the worst. But he survived, and survival was his curse. Modern medical analysis suggests that Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury, damage to the frontal lobe that governs impulse, temper, and judgment. Before this accident, Henry had been cautious, measured, even merciful compared to other monarchs. Afterward, executions multiplied without logic. Paranoia clouded his every thought, and his temper became infamous. England had gained not just a wounded king, but a wounded mind. The accident also tore open an old wound on his leg from a previous injury. Infection festered, and the ulcers became his lifelong torment. Court records describe excruciating treatments, red-hot irons pressed against his flesh to cauterize the wound, bandages dripping with pus, the king screaming in agony. The stench of decay filled the palace corridors, forcing courtiers to hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces just to stand in his presence. Imagine serving such a king. You would enter his chambers, the heavy scent of rot already clinging to the air, the sight of his once strong body now swollen and pale, his eyes flickering with rage or despair depending on the day. To serve Henry VIII was not to serve majesty, it was to serve disease incarnate. His body betrayed him, and in return he betrayed everyone who dared remind him of weakness. Pain changes men. For Henry, it did not inspire humility but wrath. He sought endless remedies. Over 300 different potions and powders cluttered his medicine chest. From ground pearls to unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, to moss scraped from human skulls, he consumed elixirs that promised salvation but delivered only disappointment. His obsession with healing turned him into a spectacle of desperation, a king chasing phantoms in bottles. By 1540, he could not bear to see his reflection. Mirrors were banned from his presence, as if the glass itself mocked him. His sleep grew erratic, days of manic wakefulness followed by collapses into near coma. Courtiers trembled when his temper shifted, reading every flicker of his expression like omens of survival. For in Henry's mind, weakness was treason, and illness was an insult to his divine right. and when the Pope refused him an annulment, Henry turned his fury not just on men, but on heaven itself. The refusal of Pope Clement VII to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1533 was the spark that set his fury ablaze. Henry was not content with rejection. He saw it as an assault on his very kingship. And so, rather than accept the authority of Rome, he severed it. With a single stroke of defiance, he transformed England's spiritual landscape, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. It was not theology, it was vengeance wrapped in royal decree. Henry claimed his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had once been wed to his late brother Arthur, but this was a lie of convenience, for Henry himself had begged papal approval to marry her years before. The truth was simpler and more selfish. Catherine could no longer give him the son he craved. For Henry, women were not companions. They were vessels, tools for dynasty. When the vessel failed, he cast it aside no matter the cost. The break with Rome was more than spiritual rebellion, it was financial plunder. Between 1536 and 1541, the dissolution of the monasteries transferred vast wealth to Henry's coffers. Monastic lands worth what would equal billions today were seized under the guise of reform. Gold chalices, melted relics, desecrated abbots dragged to the gallows. But the riches that filled the royal treasury vanished as quickly as they came, feeding wars and palaces that drained England into ruin. Henry's obsession with military glory consumed fortunes. Campaigns in France that promised triumph delivered only empty towns and wasted lives. The so-called Battle of the Spurs, which Henry hailed as a grand victory, was little more than a skirmish. Yet it devoured more coin than the entire French treasury contained. By the mid-1520s, desperation led him to debase the currency, diluting silver with base metal, unleashing inflation that crippled ordinary families who paid the price for his vanity. The Golden Prince, who once prided himself on athleticism, now sank deeper into gluttony and paranoia. He built Hampton Court Palace, spending the equivalent of tens of millions today, not as a home, but as a theater of illusion. Every tapestry, every hammer-beam roof, every candle-lit hall was a stage upon which the king pretended to be what he no longer was: strong, majestic, eternal. Behind the curtains, however, ulcers festered and his body groaned under its own weight. Even his portraiture became propaganda. In 1537, Hans Holbein painted Henry in the stance that has haunted history. Legs spread, wide arms at his sides, eyes glaring with dominance. But this image was a lie, a careful disguise. Holbein hid the ulcers with fabric, padded the king's clothes with horsehair, and used forced perspective to enlarge his frame. It was not a painting, it was a mask, one last desperate attempt to hide decay behind artistry. By the 1540s, Henry's clothing itself was grotesque theater. He owned over 2,000 garments, including cod pieces stuffed with sawdust and reinforced with whalebone exaggerations of masculinity that mocked the very idea of virility. Foreign ambassadors may have nodded in awe, but courtiers knew the truth. The king was no longer the man of legend, but a swollen parody of himself dressed in illusions he forced others to applaud. The wives of Henry VIII became the most tragic casualties of his decline. Catherine of Aragon endured 24 years, only to be cast aside as if her devotion meant nothing. Anne Boleyn was framed with false charges of adultery and incest, forced to watch her brother and friends die before her own execution. Jane Seymour gave him a son, but lost her life to infection, mourned only as the woman who had achieved the one thing he valued most. Anne of Cleves escaped by surrender. Declared too ugly by Henry, she agreed to annulment and called him brother until his death, living quietly in his shadow. Catherine Howard, barely 19, was executed for flirtations of her youth, as if her innocence itself were treason. Catherine Parr survived by suppressing her own voice, becoming his nurse, rather than his partner, enduring until the king's final breath. Each woman was less a queen than a sacrifice to Henry's ego. But beyond his wives, Henry's hunger for blood extended to tens of thousands of his subjects. Conservative estimates say 70,000 died during his reign, 5 executions a day for nearly 4 decades. Friends turned enemies, allies, discarded innocents condemned for whispers of disloyalty. England became a stage where the king's paranoia dictated life and death, and the axe fell with monotonous regularity. The Golden Prince had not just lost his crown of virtue, he had fashioned himself into a butcher king. Among Henry's most infamous betrayals was the execution of Sir Thomas More, once his closest friend and chancellor. More, one of Europe's brightest minds, refused to acknowledge Henry as head of the church. For this defiance, he was sent to the scaffold. His last words, "I die the king's good servant," but God's first echoed across Christendom, a defiant whisper against tyranny. Henry had turned a companion into a martyr, and in doing so showed the world that friendship meant nothing before his pride. Thomas Cromwell's downfall was even more chilling. Cromwell, the architect of Henry's new church and the mastermind behind the destruction of the monasteries, had served the king faithfully for years. But when Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves displeased him, Cromwell became the scapegoat. Without trial, without defense, he was executed, proof that even the most loyal servant could be discarded like a broken tool when the king's temper soured. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 revealed Henry's most duplicitous side, when 40,000 Northern Catholics rose in rebellion against his reforms. Henry promised pardon and negotiation. Trusting his word, the rebels dispersed. But once they laid down arms, he hunted their leaders and executed them mercilessly. It was betrayal disguised as mercy, a deception so cold that even his allies recoiled in shock. The king's word was now as rotten as his body. One of the darkest spectacles of his cruelty was the execution of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. At 67, she was guilty of nothing more than being mother to Cardinal Reginald Pole, who had criticized Henry from exile. Dragged to the scaffold, she resisted, declaring, "So should traitors die, and I am none." The executioner, inexperienced and trembling, hacked at her neck with multiple blows before she finally collapsed. The crowd gasped in horror. Even death was mangled under Henry's rule. The paranoia that drove Henry's reign reached fever pitch with the so-called Exeter Conspiracy. Noblemen were accused not of treasonous acts, but of whisper speculation of what might happen if Henry died without a male heir. With evidence so thin it bordered on absurd, Henry ordered their deaths anyway. The message was clear in his kingdom: even thoughts could kill you. Fear became law, and silence the only shield. By his final years, Henry was a grotesque shadow of the youth he once was. His body so swollen it required machines to move him, his ulcers dripping with infection, his moods swinging from violent rages to pitiful despair. The once vibrant king who danced, hunted, and composed now spent his days shuffling between rooms carried by servants who prayed not to displease him. The mighty monarch had become a prisoner of his own flesh. When death finally came in January 1547, it brought not relief, but further humiliation. His body, so bloated with gases of decay, could barely be embalmed. Wrapped in lead and sealed in coffins, he was paraded to Windsor Castle. But at Sion Abbey, the unthinkable happened. The coffin burst. Putrid remains spilled onto the floor, the stench choking the air. Dogs were said to lick what was left of the king who had once proclaimed himself God's representative on earth. The symbolism was grotesque and perfect. The king who had inflated himself with divine authority now burst like a carcass on the road, his grandeur dissolving into filth. Courtiers covered their faces. Peasants whispered of curses fulfilled. And even in death, Henry ruled through horror. His body became the final metaphor for his reign, bloated, corrupt, and doomed to rupture under its own weight. When his tomb was later opened in 1813, investigators found evidence confirming the explosion. Damaged coffins, stains of decomposed matter, scars of the horror long whispered. History had not lied. The nightmare of Henry's funeral was as real as the terror of his life. England's king had left behind not dignity, but decay. His attempt at eternal majesty had failed. What remained was the grotesque memory of a man who could not escape his own corruption. Henry's legacy was not the strong monarchy he dreamed of. He left England bankrupt, its faith fractured, its people weary of war and fear. His only son, Edward VI, was a sickly boy who died at 15. Mary I burned hundreds at the stake in religious frenzy. Only Elizabeth III salvaged the dynasty with her 45-year reign. The man who killed 2 wives to secure a male heir was ultimately succeeded by daughters who proved far greater rulers. His life was proof that power without restraint breeds ruin, and that the Golden Prince had become England's eternal warning. Henry VIII's tragedy was not only in his body but in the illusion he clung to. Even as his ulcers consumed him, he demanded to be painted, sculpted, and remembered as the virile hero he once was. His portraits showed a towering figure with broad shoulders and commanding eyes. Yet behind the canvas he was wheeled about by contraptions, unable to mount a horse, unable even to climb stairs without pain. His legacy was painted with lies. The Holbein portrait, with its wide stance and bulging codpiece, was designed as propaganda, not reality. Henry's legs were hidden beneath ornate fabric to conceal sores. His chest was padded to mimic muscle. The codpiece, absurdly enlarged, became both a symbol of his insecurity and a grotesque parody of manhood. Diplomats stared in awe, but courtiers whispered. The image of strength was just that, an image. His signature, too, became a performance. As arthritis deformed his hands, he developed an elaborate flourish that stretched across entire lines of documents. Henry R. was no longer just a name. It was a spectacle of ink, a declaration of power even when his fingers trembled. Every stroke was an attempt to command authority his body had already lost. Paper carried the illusion his flesh could not. Henry's court was a world of shadows and silence. Servants learned to predict his moods by the set of his jaw, the glint in his eyes. One wrong word could mean imprisonment or death. Music still played in the hall's feasts, still dazzled, but beneath the laughter lay dread. Every banquet was a gamble, every smile a mask. To live at court was to dance on a floor slick with blood. Behind the feasts and masks, Henry's paranoia bled into policy. He viewed illness as rebellion, weakness as treason. Physicians who failed to cure him were dismissed or punished. Food tasters grew more numerous, not just for poison, but for fear that certain meats worsened his ulcers. Even his closest advisors spoke with trembling voices, measuring every syllable. The king's pain had become the nation's torment. The dissolution of monasteries did more than fill his coffers. It tore at the spiritual fabric of England. Monks cast into poverty libraries, burned relics, smashed. The people who had once sought comfort in abbeys found only ruins. The wealth Henry seized vanished into wars and palaces, leaving nothing but resentment. The common folk whispered that England itself had been cursed, its soul traded for the king's vanity. Henry's obsession with heirs haunted him like a specter. He executed wives, banished daughters, and dreamed of dynasties secured by sons. Yet irony mocked him. The boy he won, Edward VI, was fragile and doomed to die young, while the daughters he disregarded, Mary and Elizabeth, would outlast him and rule. It was as if fate itself conspired to humiliate the king who demanded control over everything. Mary's reign drenched in fire, and executions carried forward the darkness Henry left. Elizabeth's brilliance, though luminous, was born from the ashes of her father's tyranny. The Tudor dynasty survived, but the scars of Henry's reign never healed. His shadow loomed over every successor, a reminder that England had once been ruled by a man who mistook cruelty for strength. Historians debate whether Henry's descent into tyranny was driven by brain injury, chronic pain, or sheer hunger for power. Perhaps it was all three. Yet millions endure suffering without becoming murderers. Henry's curse was not just illness, but authority unchecked, fear unchallenged, and silence enforced. The crown gave him the power to make others bleed for his wounds, and that was his true disease. In the end, Henry VIII's story is not just about a king. It is about the corruption of power, the fragility of flesh, and the danger of silence. His reign stands as a warning etched in blood and rot, that greatness can curdle into monstrosity, that beauty can decay into horror, and that unchecked authority is the most grotesque poison of all. The Golden Prince became the Butcher King, and his ghost still whispers from the ruins of England's past. In his youth, Henry's laughter rang through hunting lodges and music halls, but by his later years, silence followed him like a shroud. Courtiers no longer dared to jest in his presence. Musicians played softer, their notes trembling under the weight of his gaze. What once had been a lively Renaissance court transformed into a stage for fear where even joy was censored by the king's pain. Foreign ambassadors reported the strange atmosphere. They wrote of a monarch who rarely left his chambers, whose stench traveled ahead of him, whose anger burned hotter than ever, even as his body collapsed. They described a king who demanded to be seen as a lion, but who shuffled like an invalid carried by men who loathed the task. The contrast between the myth and the reality grew impossible to hide. The people of England, too, began to whisper. Once Henry had dazzled them with pageantry and charisma, but now he was feared more than loved. Rumors of his ulcers, his erratic rages, his endless executions spread through taverns and marketplaces. To peasants, the king was no longer a distant symbol of glory, but a looming shadow of cruelty whose hunger for blood and coin reached even the poorest homes. Henry's financial ruin became the nation's burden. Inflation surged as silver coins lost their purity. Farmers and craftsmen saw their livelihoods shrink while the king's feasts grew larger, his palaces more extravagant. Bread became dear taxes heavier, and resentment smoldered among those who once cheered his triumphs. The crown's debts swelled and England teetered on the edge of collapse. The irony of Henry's reign was that his desperation for legacy destroyed the very stability his father had built. Henry VII had left a treasury full, a kingdom relatively at peace, a monarchy respected. Henry VIII squandered it all on vanity wars, fleeting romances, and monuments to his ego. In chasing immortality, he guaranteed only infamy. The Tudor name glowed bright for a moment, then flickered in the smoke of his ruin. Even in his own family, fear reigned supreme. His daughter Mary, separated from her mother, Catherine of Aragon, grew up scarred by her father's rejection. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, carried the stigma of her mother's execution. Edward, the long-desired son, inherited a kingdom poisoned by debt and division. The children of Henry VIII bore the cost of his obsessions, their lives shaped by the ghosts of his decisions. As Henry aged, he turned increasingly to ritual and control. Feasts became grotesque performances with endless dishes paraded before a man who could barely eat. Ceremonies stretched long, with Henry elevated high above courtiers to disguise his inability to move. Every gesture, every proclamation was meant to remind the world that he was still the king. Yet the more he insisted, the more obvious his frailty became. His religious authority, born of rebellion, hardened into tyranny. Though Henry never embraced Protestant theology, he wielded his title as supreme head of the church like a weapon. Priests and bishops bent their sermons to his will. Heretics burned, Catholics imprisoned, and England's faith fractured under the weight of one man's pride. What began as a personal quarrel with the Pope became a national wound that bled for generations. By the last years of his life, Henry had become both a spectacle and a warning. Visitors to court saw a monarch wrapped in gold cloth shining under candlelight, yet reeking of decay beneath the robes. His words carried the force of law, but his body carried the marks of death. He embodied the paradox of power, terrifying and pitiful, feared and mocked, worshipped and cursed. And so, when his coffin burst and spilled its contents before horrified mourners, it felt like the final judgment of fate. No painter's brush, no royal decree, no wealth or terror could prevent the inevitable collapse. Henry VIII's body betrayed him just as his reign betrayed his people. The explosion was not only of flesh, but of legacy, the shattering of illusions, leaving only truth that even kings rot and that power built on fear will always end in ruin. Those who witnessed Henry's decline carried the memories like scars. Servants spoke in whispers long after his death, recalling the unbearable odor, the unpredictable wrath, the sight of their once vigorous master reduced to groaning immobility. They remembered not just a king, but a man whose very presence drained life from those around him. To serve Henry was to live with dread in your stomach and the taste of fear on your tongue. In the villages beyond the palace walls, stories of Henry blurred with legend. Mothers warned their children of the tyrant king who executed thousands, who turned faith into fire, who consumed wealth until nothing remained. His reign became folklore, half history, half nightmare. Even peasants who had never seen his face could describe the swollen monarch carried on machines dripping pus, a monster in robes of gold. Yet Henry himself never saw a monster in the mirror. He forbade mirrors, true, but in his mind, he was still the chosen prince destined to rule by divine right. Pain only deepened his conviction. To him, illness was proof of God's test, and rage was a sacred flame. His delusion was complete. The man who smelled of decay believed he embodied heaven's authority. This was the most terrifying illusion of all. Some courtiers pitied him, seeing in his eyes not only anger but desperation. Sleepless nights left him hollow-eyed, muttering prayers, demanding potions, cursing unseen enemies. They watched him gorge on food, then cry out in agony as ulcers throbbed and bowels failed. For a fleeting moment, one might glimpse a man crushed by his own suffering. But pity quickly curdled into fear because his pain was never endured alone. He always made others share it. The medical remedies he consumed only worsened his torment. Unicorn horn ground pearls moss from skulls. Each bizarre cure promised hope, but delivered poison. Physicians, terrified to admit failure, prescribed concoctions that inflamed his condition. The royal body became a laboratory of superstition, a stage where science and magic blurred, and the patient was both king and victim. Every gulp of potion was a reminder even the wealthiest man in England could not buy relief. Henry's inability to control his own body fueled his obsession with controlling everything else. His temper, once restrained, now erupted in violence. Ministers fell. Wives died. Rebels were butchered. The more his flesh betrayed him, the more he demanded obedience from others. The throne became his weapon against mortality, as though ruling with terror might silence the ticking clock of his own decay. Yet death crept closer, indifferent to crowns and palaces. Each year brought greater agony, festering ulcers, failing heart-swollen legs, a body collapsing under its own weight. Physicians disguised despair with elaborate rituals, but even they knew the truth. The king who once dazzled Europe now terrified even his healers. They did not fear his disease. They feared his rage when told nothing could save him. The irony was cruel. Henry had torn apart a church, executed wives, and drained his kingdom to secure an heir and a dynasty. Yet his son, Edward VI, would die a child, his kingdom fractured. Mary would reign in fire and persecution. Elizabeth would restore strength, but in ways her father never imagined. The daughters he dismissed became the true architects of England's survival, while the son he exalted vanished into the shadows of history. And so Henry's grand ambition, immortality through power, bloodline, and faith, dissolved into ash. He had achieved nothing lasting except fear. His wars left no glory, only debts. His faith left no unity, only division. His body left no awe, only revulsion. He had begun as Europe's brightest prince, and ended as its most grotesque warning. The dynasty he sought to immortalize outlived him, but not because of him, rather despite him. When historians look back at Henry VIII, they see not just a king, but a mirror of power itself. His reign is the story of how beauty becomes decay, how love becomes betrayal, how faith becomes politics, and how unchecked authority consumes both ruler and realm. His body rotted, his kingdom bled, and his coffin burst open for all to see. The horror of Henry VIII is not merely in what he did, it is in what he became. In the centuries after his death, the legend of Henry VIII only grew darker. Writers, poets, and playwrights remembered him not as the radiant youth of his coronation, but as the tyrant with the rotting body. His name became shorthand for cruelty, excess, and arrogance. The rhyme about his 6 wives, divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived, reduces human lives to grim footnotes in his shadow. History remembered not his music or his poetry, but his acts. Archaeologists and historians who examined his vault centuries later confirmed what the chroniclers had whispered: the damage to his coffin. The grotesque swelling, the chaos of his burial were real. It was as if the truth itself clawed its way out of the grave, refusing to be hidden beneath marble and gold. Even death could not conceal Henry's corruption. His tomb was a monument not to majesty but to decay. Yet there remains a haunting fascination with Henry VIII. Tourists flock to Hampton Court, gaze upon Holbein's portrait, and whisper about the wives, the executions, the scandals. Why? Perhaps because his story touches on something deeper than history. It touches the fear within us all. The fear of losing beauty, of losing control, of watching greatness rot into monstrosity. In Henry, we see the horror of mortality magnified by power. His life is a reminder that absolute authority does not heal wounds, it infects them. Henry could command armies, rewrite laws, and silence popes. But he could not silence his body's collapse. Every scream from his chamber, every drop of pus from his ulcers, every axe stroke against the condemned was a declaration of his helplessness. He could make England tremble, but he could not stop the march of time. The reign of Henry VIII shows us how suffering, when mixed with pride, can destroy nations. Millions suffer illness with dignity, endure pain with patience, and cling to compassion despite hardship. Henry did the opposite. His wounds became weapons. His fears became laws. His agony became a plague upon his people. His tragedy was not his pain alone. It was the power to spread that pain to everyone under his crown. Some historians argue we should pity him, that he was a victim of fate, of injuries and diseases beyond his control. And there is truth in that. The young Henry, vibrant and promising, never dreamed he would die in filth and paranoia. Yet pity must be weighed against responsibility. He chose cruelty. He chose betrayal. He chose to drown his kingdom in fear. Illness may excuse weakness, but it cannot excuse tyranny. As the centuries pass, Henry VIII endures as a ghostly warning. His portraits still stare down at us with manufactured strength, daring us to believe the illusion. But the truth lurks beneath ulcers, paranoia, betrayal, and rot. Behind every golden tapestry lies the stench of corruption. Behind every crown lies the reminder that flesh decays and power corrupts. His story is not ancient, it is eternal. For what is Henry's legacy? A nation fractured, a treasury, emptied, a dynasty built on blood. His son dead young, his daughters scarred his people, burdened by debts and divisions. He left no empire, no triumph, no glory. Only the memory of how power can twist a man into something less than human. The Butcher King remains immortal only in infamy. And so Henry VIII's life closes not with the triumph of a hero, but with the scream of a cautionary tale. His crown was heavy with gold, but heavier still with guilt. His body burst open, but it was his soul that had long been decayed. England survived him, but never forgot him. The king who once glowed like the sun became the specter who darkened every chamber he entered. What if I told you that the most powerful man in England became its most grotesque warning? Henry VIII's life was a tale of beauty, turned horror of promise, turned betrayal of flesh, turned carrion. His story is not just about history. It is about us. For whenever power goes unchecked, whenever pain becomes excuse for cruelty, whenever silence allows tyranny to thrive, we risk becoming like Henry. Remember the Golden Prince. Remember the Butcher King. and ask yourself, what horrors are we turning a blind eye to today?